Selvin, Selvin,
I am available, no?
yeah. Do
Just
shall we start now because we need some time for the introduction and all that? Shall we? Because or shall we
okay.
wait for another 2 3 minutes?
Yeah, normally we start at 6:30.
Okay, fine.
Yeah,
Yeah, we can wait for three more minutes. It's
yeah,
already six
correct,
twenty
correct. Yeah.
four. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
okay, man. So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the international webinar organized by the Department of English, St. Joseph University, Dindivanam. So, this is the seventh webinar in the international webinar series on emerging trends in the humanities. So, today, the webinar topic is Decolonizing Knowledge, Post-Colonial and Decolonial Humanities. To start with, I welcome Dr. Professor Joseph Dunstan to introduce the distinguished speaker of the day. Anand, please.
A very good evening to everyone. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lakshmi Sukumar, an associate professor of English from the Institute of English, Kerala University. With more than 18 years of teaching experience, she has involved herself in research, academic administration, and other areas of women's studies. She has also served as honorary director of Center for Women's Studies in University of Kerala. Currently, she is the academic coordinator of Center for Undergraduate Studies. Her area of specializations include critical theory, media studies, women and law, and Kerala studies. Her research adopts interdisciplinary approach to culture, media, law, politics, and contemporary humanities with a particular focus on the questions of representation, identity, technology, and social justice. She has also chaired the Board of Studies in the Institute of English and also the Board of Question Paper Setting in Calicut University, Kerala. Her scholarship is committed to interdisciplinary humanities, fostering critical inquiry through teaching, research, and curriculum development, also with public engagement. She actively contributes to academic discussions through lectures, blogs, podcasts, and other educational platforms. With such a rich experience, we are really fortunate to have you, ma'am, on this webinar, the seventh webinar today on colonial knowledge and post-colonial knowledge. Ma'am, thank you very much for being with us. And now I would like to request you to join us. The podium, the virtual podium is yours. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that very detailed introduction, for being very gracious enough to list out all the kinds of engagements I have been through so far in my career. And hello and good evening to each and every one of you who have joined here. And I should say that I'm indeed quite honored to be here, to be a part of this emerging webinar series on emerging trends in humanities. Basically, because this is something that this kind of a discussion is quite relevant and something highly important in the in 2026, when we think of humanities, each one of us who belong to the humanities departments, we are forced to reinforce our relevance, and we always have to explain why we should exist, why we should continue to exist. The humanities departments across India as well as globally as well, the kind of challenges that humanities is facing in the context of the digital infrastructures and artificial intelligence. So when technology is ruling the world, why should we continue to have very strong discussions under the larger rubric of humanities is something that we need to be doing more and more. So, first and foremost, I would like to sincerely thank Professor Joseph Dunstan for being in touch with me and having me here, inviting me for this conversation. And I also thank Dr. Selvin, who is the convener, for putting together very interesting sessions under the larger idea of humanities, and the way in which uh, the organizers have tried to conceptualize humanities from a variety of perspectives. It's something that really needs to be appreciated. So, thanks to you, and definitely these kinds of conversations are really what we should definitely be having more and more across the academic spaces. Now, as far as since I belong to the English department of the University of Kerala, and today, as the title of my presentation indicates, it's more or less about post-coloniality and decoloniality as well, a way in which we have to engage with post-colonialism. And now we are also into a phase where there are many levels of discussions happening on decolonizing knowledge. So from the colonial period, from coloniality to, or from the period of colonialism to post-colonialism, and finally into this phase of decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing our understanding. So these kinds of shifts that we have been through, and we continue to encounter different kinds of shifts and patterns in this particular domain. This is a concern that we still, because especially in the 21st century, together with technology, we are also debating questions of the nation, the questions of language, questions of representations. So definitely post-colonialism and decolonizing knowledge systems, these are some of the very pertinent theoretical frames that take us through some of the very political and philosophical issues when it comes to who gets to speak and who speaks for whom, and whose voices are accounted for, or whose voices are recorded. So all these kinds of hierarchies and power structures in society, which we still continue to negotiate with, definitely a kind of a detailed understanding of the post-colonial discussions, and also where we have now shifted to the decolonizing paradigms, really would help us to be more critically informed of the social systems into which we are situated right now. And also it would also help us to see why we should have humanities or decolonial humanities as a very strong epistemic foundation, which can actually help us to ensure that we bring into visibility a variety of sections of society, or a number of categories of people who still continue to remain invisible, or whose voices are never taken into account when decisions are being made, when casualties happen, or when any kind of calamities happen, or whenever there is a question of defining identities. So in all these cases, there are too many levels of erasures that we also encounter in our in the societies that we live in. So post-colonial theory as well as the decolonial theorizations have really helped the academic world in trying to negotiate with and again trying to engage with these kinds of concerns with new critical concepts and perspectives. So now I'd like to take you through some of the major ways in which we can look into post-colonial ideas, and also the ways in which we have to give a new kind of emphasis to this idea of decoloniality and decolonial humanities in order to break the existing structures, in order to unlearn what we have so far internalized in different ways, and to see the world in entirely a different kind of perspective, which is really the need of the hour. So with these words of introduction, now let me just share my slides with you. 1 second. Okay, I hope the slides are visible, right? The very first slide with the
Yes,
title.
ma'am. The slides are visible and you are audible. Thank you.
Okay. So, as the first slide indicates, the title of this presentation is Decolonizing Knowledge, Postcolonial and Decolonial Humanities. And to begin with, as a matter of introduction, when we think of post-colonialism as well as decoloniality, decolonial humanities, there are certain concepts and terms that we always encounter. And two of those very significant concepts are one, representation, and the other one, epistemology. So, whenever we think of post colonial discussions, representation is a concept, representation is a kind of theoretical idea that gets always used, and that helps us to engage with the different ways in which power dynamics worked during the colonial times, and how the post-colonial theoreticians have tried to unravel these kinds of power or these kinds of discursive patterns in the representations. So when we think of from post-colonialism to decolonizing the humanities, when we think of decolonizing the humanities, one of the most relevant questions, which may at times appear to be very simple, but it's really a theoretically consequential question, that is, who has the authority to decide what counts as knowledge? So, this is a question that takes us beyond the familiar historical understanding of colonialism, where we used to engage with colonialism as a territorial occupation or political control or even economic exploitation. From those kinds of very basic ideas about colonialism, we shift to a domain where we see colonialism also as an epistemic project. So, in this epistemic project, what has always happened is different kinds of naming and mapping of territories, classification of populations, or even the construction of racial and cultural hierarchies, production of ethnographic knowledge, establishment of archives. So, a variety of ways in which categorizations, cataloging, standardizations have happened as a part of colonialism. And these are the kinds of interventions, colonial interventions, that really take us to the idea of the politics of representation as well as the politics of epistemology, because colonial power, it operated not only by determining what colonized people could do, but also by shaping what could be known about them, or who could know them, or which forms of knowledge could claim the status of truth. So this epistemological dimension is very crucial as far as post-colonial and decolonial discussions are concerned. And when it comes to humanities, there these epistemological issues, they attain a greater significance, because in humanities what really happens is in different institutionalized spaces, we actually try to engage with, we critically examine the different kinds of knowledge that we have acquired and different kinds of knowledge that are in the process of getting formulated. So when it comes to different disciplines that come under humanities, we have literature, history, philosophy, anthropology. What we usually do in the humanities departments is, we, rather than just preserving the existing body of knowledge, we always go deeper into the question of how do we decide what is worthy of studying, or who becomes a canonical writer, or who becomes a scholar, a theoretician whose studies are considered to be significant enough, or which texts are being brought into the discussion, or what methods are legitimate, or which are the languages that are privileged and which languages are getting erased, or getting, or languages that are becoming extinct. So, or the kind of interpretations, whose interpretations are taken into account, or whose interpretations are totally negated. So these kinds of concerns that we come to engage with in the humanities department, definitely these concerns also become, they are also part of post-colonial and decolonial discussions, especially the question of knowledge and the way in which we read and understand the society and the different kinds of experiences of people. So this entire presentation I have tried to put together in a way which, in which I am trying to highlight this kind of a proposition that decolonizing knowledge, it's not simply a project of inclusion, because usually we, when we uh, think of any kind of knowledge system which is very strongly conditioned by the power structures, we always think of exclusion and inclusion. But decolonizing knowledge is not something just about inclusion, but because it is more about a project of epistemic transformation. That is, we are trying to see how certain kinds of historical conditions, how it actually resulted in the formation of, or in the validation of, certain kinds of knowledge systems which acquired universal authority. And when some kinds of knowledge systems gained universal authority, what simultaneously happened was that certain other knowledge systems and sections of society were rendered local, traditional, or primitive, or they were invisibilized in a variety of ways. So this is something that that would define, this particular argument is what would define almost the entire presentation, where we are trying to look into how the post-colonial as well as the decolonial discussions are taking us towards different kinds of the different perspectives and different moments that we encounter, or even trying to tell us that the kinds of gaps and silences that we are encountering in different narratives are to be seriously taken up, and the ways in which even the digital economy, the digital platforms also continue to reinforce certain kinds of hierarchies, and they also are conditioned by the global power systems, which also require a detailed critical analysis under the larger rubric of humanities and decolonial humanities. So now, when we come to the question of knowledge, so as knowledge is a very significant concern in these different paradigms, and in the decolonial theory of knowledge, it is basically trying to tell us that there is no way in which we can consider knowledge to be completely objective or innocent or something that is detached from power, because every system of knowledge, whatever we think of as, when we feel that, or when we claim that we know certain things, every concept that we think of under the larger title of knowledge or knowledge system, they are all produced within historically specific institutions, or they are always controlled and conditioned by different kinds of conceptual frameworks and relations of power. And here, Michel Foucault's concept of discourse and the ways in which power and knowledge are always having a very close nexus, where power knowledge, the kind of dual engagement between power and knowledge actually leads towards different kinds of knowledge systems and the different kinds of hierarchies in society. So here, power does not just merely prohibit or censor knowledge, it participates in producing the categories, producing the norms and discourses through which some people, some sections of society, some experiences become a part of knowledge system, and some kind of experiences or situations are rendered unintelligible. So what is intelligible and what is unintelligible? This is a very crucial question that these kinds of knowledge productions, these kinds of discussions always try to engage with. And these institutionalized spaces are always, whether it be a university or a school or even the hospital, even the prison, the prison systems that we have across the country, all these are different ways in which power functions, and also the power systems try to define identities as well. So these kinds of observations, classifications that the power systems always try to engage with, they actually, the power controls the society. Together with power is also always trying to condition the human beings in as specific kinds of subjects who can be controlled and who can always be put into different kinds of categories and classifications. And this particular pattern of knowledge formation, the kind of epistemic engagements with the society, is something that was very significant right from the period of colonialism. Because if knowledge is produced through institutional practices, colonial institutions, definitely it was not just about governing populations. These colonial institutions also simultaneously they were engaged in producing knowledge about the populations which these institutions governed. For instance, the census, map, ethnographic report, linguistic classification. So there are a variety of sites through which the colonial administrators tried to create and circulate knowledge about the societies which they controlled. So in order to, so colonial, for the colonial discourse, knowledge was a very significant tool, a very powerful tool, which on the one side they used to describe the colonized societies, but on the other side they also tried to ensure that they have enough information to control and administer those societies. But then comes the larger question, uh, who decides whether a particular kind of knowledge is true? Or there are a variety of questions when we engage with any kind of knowledge, any kind of discussion and explanation about a society or a particular practice or ritual or any kind of events from history or even in the contemporary times. Definitely, before trying to understand or before trying to limit ourselves to the meaning of that particular event, there are a variety of questions that we need to ask. Who produced it? Or what were the institutional conditions that resulted in the formation of that particular knowledge system? Or what were the kinds of languages that were used that were able to carry these ideas? And who was authorized to create this knowledge system, or who validated this knowledge system? So there are these different kinds of questions that move us from epistemology as an abstract theory of knowledge towards epistemology as a politics of knowledge, where it is about the way in which societies are shaped and conditioned and categorized, defined, and hierarchies are reinforced. So, here, from an abstract idea of epistemology as a branch of philosophy, we come through the post colonial discussions, and when we go deeper into the colonial interventions, we tend to realize that epistemology has to be understood as a politics of knowledge. And now the next major concern is, so how colonialism is definitely an epistemic project beyond the territoriality or beyond the question of controlling sections of society, controlling different parts of the globe, and so on. So definite, and here classification, as I've already mentioned, the question of mapping, naming, classifying. So all these kinds of category building hierarchies were constructed in different domains. For instance, languages were there was a hierarchy of languages that were created. Then cultural practices, some cultural practices were considered or labeled as scientific, and some were labeled as superstitious. Then these terms, modern and traditional, who decides what is modern and what is traditional, or what is rational and irrational? So these kinds of epistemic injustices or epistemic inequalities always were a part of the colonial period. The colonizer occupied the position of the knowing subject, while the colonized increasingly became the object of knowledge. So, what really happened during the period of colonization was that the colonized world was something to be studied, described, classified, interpreted, and explained. And the implications of this was really enormous, because when this kind of a knowledge system was very strongly being constructed by the colonizers, then there are also situations where whoever is not included into these categories or into these classifications, they are totally erased, or they are totally invisibilized. So there are cultures which get eliminated. There are sections of society which are criminalized. There are customs which are labeled as superstitious. So all these are from a kind of a colonial lens, a colonial perspective, colonial point of view, or colonial epistemology. Thus, it actually involved a kind of a movement from the difference between the colonizer and colonized to a question of classification. And through the classification, hierarchies were constructed. And through these hierarchies, the colonial administrators made to, or they created a situation where they could govern the colonized societies in a much easier and stronger form. So this is where decolonization becomes very significant as a theoretical framework that can take us towards the epistemic legacy that defined colonialism, because colonialism was not just about governance and control, but it was also about knowledge production. And that is where decolonization tries to come in and trying to which will try to help us to unravel the complexities of knowledge production of the colonial times. Now, when we think of the post-colonial theories, definitely Edward Said happens to be a very prominent name, and Said's Orientalism is considered to be a foundational text to the entry into post-colonial theorizations. And here, Said's importance lies not merely in demonstrating that Western representations of the East were stereotypical, but his major interventions were also about how the Orient was produced as an object of knowledge. So, in his discussion about the Orient, in his work Orientalism, he was trying to see or explain how different kinds of binaries were constructed, or there were a set of terms that were used to construct binary discourses on the colonizer and the colonized, where the colonizers were always defined using terms like rational, modern, scientific, while the colonized were always labeled as irrational or traditional, or even mysterious, and so on. So here it is not just a mere description of the Orient that happened through the colonizers. It was basically about a production of knowledge, a production of a particular kind of understanding about the colonized societies, where the representation of the colonized itself was a political exercise. Representation actually here participated in determining what reality becomes intelligible, or what are the kinds of ideas that the larger world was getting about the colonized societies through the kinds of narratives, through the kinds of knowledge systems that the colonizers built. So the Orient was always a product of colonial epistemology, it was constructed through certain kinds of words and vocabulary, and it was again it was actually put together. There were a set of ideas that were put together to define this larger world of the Orient and to define it as a field of knowledge. So here, Said's work is also very closely influenced by Foucault, because this idea of discourse and how, when it comes to the idea of the colonial times, the kind of governance that existed during the colonial times, how there was always an excess between power and knowledge, and these category building of categories and defining identities were all a part of the colonial governance project. And here, many of the concerns that Foucault had theorized on regarding power and the kind of hierarchies in societies, we find those kinds of theoretical frames being used by Said to get into the colonial discourses and trying to see how the Orient was constructed as an object of knowledge through different kinds of representations in the colonial narratives. And then when it comes to these representations, there is an authority that these representations actually gained, or they were enjoying during the colonial times, because when the colonizers created certain forms of representations, they actually it actually involved the power to name people, name societies, to define, to classify, to interpret, even to normalize certain kinds of identity formations and so on. So definitely it also leads to the larger question: who has the right to represent whom? So representation itself becomes a political tool, and representation also leads us to the larger question: who has the epistemic authority to decide how to represent sections of society, or how to represent people belonging to different kinds of identities? And this question has particular importance in the humanities, because academic research often reproduces a distinction between the researcher and the researched, where the researcher is always positioned as the subject of knowledge, where the community is positioned as the object of knowledge. So, this distinction, though it appears to be quite natural, but when we think about this distinction from the point of view of the post-colonial theorizations, we realize that the way in which this binary exists, the researcher and the researched, it's a very problematic kind of binary. And there is an assumption that the researcher automatically possesses greater epistemic authority than the community being studied. And this was exactly the kind of approach that was taken by the colonial administrators and scholars when they tried to go deeper into the non-Western societies, trying to understand and go deeper into the kind of practices that existed in these societies. And together with Edward Said, we have Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who also tried to focus on this question of epistemology and the way in which societies and the way in which certain voices are considered to be intelligible, and some voices are considered to be totally beyond any kind of significance or relevance. And the most significant work that Spivak has contributed towards this discussion is Can the Subaltern Speak? And at times when we discuss Can the Subaltern Speak, we at times reduce it to the proposition that oppressed people are silenced. But Spivak's argument is something more complex. It's not simply about the oppressed people lacking a voice, but it's more about how their voice is at times rendered illegible, or something that doesn't make sense within the larger dominant structures of representation. So it's not always the case that the oppressed people are not having any voice. The oppressed person or the people belonging to the oppressed sections of the society may speak, but there are situations where either their voice would be silenced, either their voice would not be heard in any form by those in power, their voices may get mistranslated, because most of the time these the people belonging to the subaltern sections, especially in the colonial times, they use the regional languages, and definitely there would be translations of their conversations, which could also lead to the wrong kind of translations, appropriations of their voice, and how these voices were at times appropriated into the institutionalized discourses that were controlled by the colonizers. So, in these ways, there was always this question of epistemic legibility. What is considered to be of relevance from that particular colonial epistemic perspective, and what were the ways in which voices were there was a hierarchy that was always reinforced in the society when it comes to the ways in which people can express their experiences, or express their problems, express their issues with the political systems of the times. And then another major post-colonial theorist who has tried to get into the nuances of the kind of identities that were constructed during the colonial times is Homi K. Bhabha, who actually has problematized the binary between colonizer and colonized. And he has used concepts like mimicry, hybridity, ambivalence, and the third space in order to go deeper into the ways in which the colonial discourses attempted to construct a stable distinction between the colonizer and colonized. So here, Homi K. Bhabha was trying to contest that kind of a stable distinction between the colonizer and the colonized. And here, he was trying to go deeper into the kind of hybrid identities, or the ways in which the colonized subject tried to mimic the colonizers, and the ways in which the colonized subjects at times they appropriated the colonizers language. So the epistemological significance of Bhabha's intervention is that colonial knowledge is never completely stable. The categories imposed by colonial authority, it can be appropriated and transformed by those subjected to them. So here he is trying to bring in a different kind of perspective about post-colonial knowledge, where it is not merely a recovery of an authentic pre-colonial past, it's also a creative practice of re-articulations. So there, when it comes to this idea of hybridity, or this kind of ambivalence, the idea of ambivalence that he used in these cases, what he was trying to argue is that this kind of a very clean binary difference between the colonizer and colonized was just a myth or an illusion, because when two types of societies, two types of sections of two people belonging to two different parts of the globe, they come in contact with each other, definitely there are ways in which they get conditioned in different ways. Even the colonizers have also been influenced by the colonized society. So there is no way in which we can have always a top down approach where the colonizer is always controlling the colonized, and the colonized remain a kind of a passive group of people. And from colonialism to coloniality. So that is the shift that we find happening towards the end of the 20th century, because from post there was a time when the discussions of the colonial period was confined to the theoretical frame of post colonialism, but gradually it started moving towards decoloniality, where it was a way in which a very crucial conceptual distinction was being made between colonialism and coloniality. So here, colonialism refers to identifiable systems of political, territorial, and economic domination. And most of the time in the post-colonial discussions, the assumption was that the post-colonial theorists were trying to look into the past, look into the colonial period, or the period that existed or the times that existed during the colonial rule, and trying to engage with the kind of representations, with the kind of discussions and hierarchies that existed in the colonial societies. So post-colonial theoreticians, more or less, they were trying to critique and understand and explain the colonial times, the colonial societies, and the kind of social experiences that people had during the period of colonialism. But coloniality is a term that refers to the persistence of the structures of hierarchy that we otherwise associate with colonialism or colonial modernity, even after colonial rule has ended. So there is a subtle difference between colonialism and coloniality, because colonialism, more or less, it's always about the period of the colonial governance and how with independence there is this assumption that colonialism as a phase in the history of a country has already it has entered, and we enter into a new phase of post colonialism. But coloniality is actually trying to problematize this very easy demarcation between colonialism and post colonialism by trying to argue that political independence does not necessarily eliminate many of the colonial structures that were put in place during the colonial rule. For instance, the languages, the educational structures, or the colonial archives, the racial hierarchies, the Eurocentric knowledge systems. So, all these kinds of, or epistemic hierarchies, all these kinds of discourses uh, are always, they continue to exist in the erstwhile colonies even when the colonizers have left the country. So there it is about, rather than asking the question when did colonialism end, decolonial theory actually asks which structures of coloniality continue to organize the present. So this is a very significant distinction between colonialism and coloniality, and this distinction is central to the work of theorists like Annibal Quijano. And again, this is a very significant concern discussed under the kind of discussions that happen under modernity and coloniality. And when we come to Quijano and the coloniality of power, Annibal Quijano's concept of the coloniality of power, it demonstrates how colonial domination became embedded in the organization of modern social relations. For instance, colonialism actually created certain connections between race, labor, capital, political authority, knowledge. So these racial classifications became a principle through which populations could be organized economically, socially, and so on. So, from a decolonial perspective, when we think of modernity, modernity is not just about the history of enlightenment or reason, science, capitalism, and so on. Uh, Decolonial insight about modernity also brings into the discussion questions of conquest, racialization, slavery, colonial extraction, dispossession, and so on. So this produces one of decolonial theory's most important propositions, that is, modernity and coloniality. They are not simply successive historical periods, but they are historically entangled formations. So even when we have the ending of the political control of the colonizer over the colonized, we still continue to be situated within many of the colonial structures that were put in place during the period of colonialism. And that is where this kind of a realization that we still continue to experience the world, to define the world around us through a European or through a Western perspective, that realization is what take us to the next major concern within concept within post-colonialism, that is the idea of provincializing Europe, which was a concept proposed by Deepesh Chakravarti. And here, to provincialize Europe is not to deny the importance of European intellectual traditions, but it is to challenge the assumption that European historical experience can automatically function as the universal model of human development. So the conventional historical narrative often takes the form like European modernity being considered as the universal form of modernity. But when we approach European modernity and this question of universality from a decolonial perspective, definitely we tend to ask why should European history provide the conceptual template through which all other histories are understood? And this is a very significant turn that we have here with respect to the question of knowledge and provincializing the European systems of knowledge. Because rather than treating the concepts developed in European intellectual context as universal tools that can simply be applied elsewhere, we are here, we are going through a kind of historicizing of the concepts, which actually take us to the way in which these concepts were historically framed, defined, and the kind of assumptions that have gone into the discussions of these concepts, the social conditions, and then what are the ideas these concepts try to illuminate, and at the same time what are the kinds of concerns these concepts are evading or uh, neglecting in the process of discussion. So here, rather than trying to eliminate all possibilities of European knowledge systems, it is about decentering the claims that the European knowledge systems had during the period of colonization, or the kind of epistemic universality that the European theories tried to claim was getting decentered through this concept of provincializing Europe. And then we come to the question of theory or the theoretical discussions and the idea of geography. Because when we think of the question of knowledge systems, and definitely theoretical frameworks are really significant. And there, what we find is certain theoretical frameworks are also, or belonging to certain geographical regions, get a kind of privileged status in comparison to the kind of epistemological discussions happening in probably the global south. So this global north south divide, where global north actually was considered to be a space from where all the major theoretical discussions were emerging, and global south was considered to be a space from which there were different kinds of case studies or empirical material being identified from the global south, which could actually be explained through the theoretical concepts that were formulated in the global north. So theoretical frame, so there was a kind of hierarchy even in the ways in which theoretical frameworks were formulated, and the ways in which concepts and methodologies were put into practice in the world of knowledge, because it was mostly about the global north, or global north was the kind of the geographical region that was privileged when it comes to theory, and global south was always or mostly reduced to a place where theory is applied rather than a place from which theory can emerge. So this is again a very significant aspect that decolonizing knowledge tries to contest and challenge, because decolonizing knowledge requires more than adding global south materials to existing syllabi. So when we think of the global south and the idea of theorization, how can we lead to a situation where global south is also recognized as a site of theoretical production? And this is again one of the central questions that we have under decolonial humanities, where we are trying to give, or we are trying to engage with different possibilities, or a pluriverse of knowledge systems, where different types of knowledge systems can carry the same kind of significance that otherwise is given to the theories that emerge from the global north, or the west and the western powers. And here, together with that, we have Mignolo and the geopolitics of knowledge. Walter Mignolo's work on the geopolitics of knowledge, he actually develops this argument further. This argument regarding the kind of distinction between global north and global south, the hierarchy when it comes to theorizations and empirical studies. So here, knowledge, whichever kinds of knowledge that we encounter, are always produced somewhere. So there would be a particular language, a particular geography, a particular historical condition that actually result in the formation of a particular knowledge system. So, but then dominant epistemology is what they usually try to do is often they conceal their own location. by presenting themselves as universal. So a particular epistemology becomes universal by concealing its particularity. And that is where Mignolo's concepts of border thinking and epistemic disobedience challenge this structure. And epistemic disobedience is again an idea which is not about rejecting European thought, but it means refusing the assumption that European modernity possesses the exclusive authority to define legitimate knowledge. So here, in this concept of epistemic disobedience, it's basically a shift away from epistemic dependence to that of epistemic autonomy. And epistemic disobedience and border thinking, definitely both these terms by Mignolo actually help us in unraveling the kind of complexities of the idea of knowledge that we inherited from the colonial times. Because when it comes to border thinking, it is particularly significant because the border is not, it's not simply a geographical space, it is an epistemological location. So those who are positioned at the borders of dominant systems, they can see the limitations of the center precisely because they inhabit more than one epistemic world. So instead of trying to see knowledge as a question of center and periphery, here in the case of border thinking, it is about multiple epistemic locations, knowledge emerging from multiple locations, and how different knowledge systems always engage in a kind of dialogue. So here again, it is not a question of establishing a new center of knowledge, but it is trying to, the very idea of border thinking is trying to transform the structure of knowledge or a structure through which centers and margins are produced. So epistemic disobedience, where it is a challenge or it is a refusal to abide by or refusal to obey the kind of claims that the western theories and western systems of knowledge held. And border thinking, where you have multiple kinds of voices, multiple epistemic locations being taken into account, and how there is always a kind of dialogue between the epistemic locations. These two concepts together, epistemic disobedience and the question of border thinking by Mignolo, have really contributed to a great extent the ways in which decolonial discussions have been effective in unraveling and in dismantling many of the binaries and many of the standardized assumptions that we still continue to carry even after the end of colonialism as a political control. And here we come to the epistemologies of the South. So definitely when we take these concepts, epistemic disobedience and border thinking, it's again, it is these are the concepts that take us to different kind of engagement with the global South. And we are introduced to the epistemologies of the South, which are also equally significant, like the epistemologies of the global North, which was gaining, or which was considered to be sacrosanct, which was considered to be too significant and to be which was actually getting a kind of a universal definition. It is into that context that we have epistemologies of the South. And this is a concept, this is an approach that was taken by D'Souza Santos, who actually tries to use the word South not exclusively as a geographical concept, but it was also about the epistemological experiences produced through historical relations of colonialism or capitalism, marginalization, and so on. So here, it is not just about the South as a geographical space, it's also about the ways in which, in different societies, there could be different kinds of uh, communities, different kinds of knowledge systems which are historically suppressed or rendered invisible. So it is not just about the global South being marginalized or being given very less significance or being always sidelined. It's also about the kind of practices that existed even within the global north, where certain sections of the global north, where certain sections of the society, especially the indigenous communities, even in the global north, their knowledge systems were not recognized, and they were also experiencing different kinds of injustices and violence from the mainstream societies in the global north. So D'Souza Santos' intervention is particularly valuable because he does not simply propose replacing Western science with alternative knowledge. Instead, he argues for an ecology of knowledges in which different epistemologies can coexist and enter into critical dialogue. So basically, decolonization is not about either or, either Western knowledge or indigenous knowledge. It is about the epistemic pluralities, the pluriverses that exist in the world of knowledge, where the it is basically trying to highlight epistemic plurality and how epistemic plurality can lead us towards more nuanced and the more deeper kind of understanding about different sections of the society and different kinds of issues that the society is confronting in the 21st century. And then from epistemologies of the South, we move to the question of larger question of decolonizing knowledge, where D'Souza Santos, one of the most powerful concept was abyssal thinking, where it is about the way in which modern Western epistemology constructed a profound distinction between what is recognized as legitimate knowledge and what is rendered invisible. So, on the one side, science was valorized, law was, again, law as seen from a Western definition was always privileged. There were certain historical, certain kinds of history that were legitimized, certain kinds of knowledge was recognized. But on the other side, when it comes to oral traditions, these oral traditions were not considered to be as significant as the kind of science or law that existed in the Western society. And again, when we come to indigenous knowledge or local cosmologies, traditional medicine. So in these cases, these kinds of categories were also different forms of knowledge, but the kind of legitimacy attached to them were most of the time they were not considered to be legitimate enough, or they were not given any kind of larger relevance or importance in the society. They were reduced to a secondary status, where it was something that, or it was something against science, against rationality. That is how the Western epistemologies tried to engage with oral traditions or indigenous knowledge systems. So there was a particular perspective that the Western epistemological frameworks always tried to use to approach the indigenous knowledge systems by stating that your knowledge is wrong, or your knowledge does not qualify as knowledge. So this is again something that becomes really important. What counts as knowledge and whose knowledge is getting more validation. And so decolonizing knowledge is always about a larger kind of engagement with the kind of hierarchies that actually define what can come under the idea of knowledge. So there, it's only very recently that we find more and more discussions happening on oral traditions or indigenous knowledge systems. But right now, this is again a shift that we find happening in the world of the knowledge systems, in the world of epistemic changes that we are confronting right now. And then we come to the ecology of knowledges. That is again a decolonial standpoint, where it is about the plurality that always exists in the world of knowledge systems. So here, epistemic plurality does not require different knowledge systems to become indistinguishable. The different knowledge systems, different epistemologies may possess different methods, different histories, or different criteria of validity, but their encounter can be productive in a variety of ways. For instance, environmental knowledge. Now we are into a phase where we give more significance, or more we are throwing more light on indigenous ecological knowledge, basically because of the kind of climatic crisis that we encounter in almost all parts of the globe. But there was a time when environmental knowledge was confined to the world of science as the mainstream society understood it. So, scientific climate research always involved atmospheric modeling or satellite observation and so on. From there, we now come to a realization that indigenous ecological knowledge also have to be taken very seriously. And then here what happens from a decolonial standpoint, it is about what becomes visible when different epistemologies enter into dialogue. So that is a very significant kind of contribution that we have when we use a decolonial framework. That is this idea of knowledges, ecology of knowledges. So in every society at every point, we will have different kinds of ideas emerging on a variety of concerns that the society is grappling with. And these different knowledges, when they enter into a dialogue or a debate or a conversation, that is from where we come to different kinds of realizations or different kinds of possibilities through which we can address the particular issue. And then, sorry, I'm moving to the previous slides. Yeah. Now it's a question of epistemic plurality. This is again taking off from the previous slide that is about ecology of knowledges. That is, this is a major theoretical issue that the decolonial epistemology tries to debate with. That is the question of relativism. So, epistemic relativism is a kind of a philosophical view that the standards of knowledge or justification, they are not absolute, but they depend on and vary according to particular social or cultural conceptual frameworks. So, to say that knowledge is situated is to acknowledge its historical as well as cultural and institutional locations. And it does not mean that every proposition is equally true, but it's about the way in which decolonial humanities give emphasis to critical epistemic plurality. So, epistemic plurality is reinforced there, it is promoted there, but on the other side, it's always what is the kind of uh, the kind of evaluation that you do about any knowledge system. You are not trying to say that every knowledge system is equally something that has equal standing, but in this question of epistemic plurality, what happens is the decolonial theorists, they try to engage with different kinds of knowledges. So rather than trying to create a kind of hierarchy or create a kind of value judgment about different epistemic systems, what they are primarily concerned is to see the kind of epistemic formations that exist in different parts or amongst different sections of the society. So there is a situatedness of knowledge. Together with that, there is also this realization that every system of knowledge is not equally valid. So those kinds of nuances, where it is on the one side a question of situatedness, on the other side it's also about how we engage with these ideas. So critical epistemic plurality is what the decolonial theorists were trying to defend, where multiple knowledge systems were brought into conversation, while they also try to ensure that there were certain standards of rigor or certain standards of accountability that were always followed when it comes to the decolonial engagement with the different kinds of knowledge systems. Now, the university as an epistemic institution. So, this is again, when it comes to decolonial humanities, it's not something that we can confine to social discussions or discussions in the world of history or politics and so on. The university also happens to be a very significant site of discussion, because what is taught in universities, or what counts as evidence, what is researched, who becomes a scholar, or what constitutes theory. So definitely university is not just a space where you are sharing knowledge with the next generation. It's also about the kind of authorization or the kind of authority that is assigned to certain kinds of voices, the kind of authority that is uh, that certain kinds of texts, certain kinds of research topics get, while certain other kinds of topics or concerns are overlooked or sidelined. So university also, every university also exists as a central site of epistemic power. So there again, there is this larger question: can universities also decolonize itself? Definitely universities have to ensure that they take enough measures, they create initiatives that can actually lead to a decolonial humanities engagement with the world of knowledge, where it is about diversifying the curriculum and also trying to see, or trying to engage with different types of possible ways in which knowledge can be defined. So, epistemic engagements and a decolonial perspective, they are definitely definitely significant when it comes to how we conceptualize or how we understand the syllabus and the kind of academic interactions that happen in a university. And then the question of canon, and this is again a very political concept, that is canon. Whenever we think of canons, the list of philosophers or the list of writers that we valorize, definitely these are clearest examples of epistemic hierarchy. For instance, when it comes to Western theory, we have certain names which are always highlighted whenever there is a discussion of Western theory or philosophy, like Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Marx, and so on. But it's not just about the larger question is not about whether these thinkers are important or relevant. The question is why this genealogy can become the implicit history of theory itself, or what happens to African philosophical traditions, indigenous epistemologies, Islamic philosophy, or Buddhist epistemologies, Adivasi knowledge, vernacular intellectual traditions. So, here the problem is not merely that these traditions may be absent. The deeper problem is that the dominant genealogy can define in advance what qualifies as philosophy, theory, or serious knowledge. So this is again something that we need to be very critical about when it comes to what is theory and what is the idea of canon that we have when we engage with the academic discussions within the curriculum within the universities. And then how can we engage with or how can we handle this question of canon or this question of epistemic authority? Definitely it's not just about adding more thinkers or writers from the global south. It's also about the kind of implicit structure that continues to exist, where the European thinkers are getting labeled as theoreticians, while when you have a global south writer, it's about that writer is getting reduced to the status of a literary author. Or when it comes to an indigenous intellectual, because indigenous intellectual or indigenous writers, their literary representations by themselves are actually holding larger philosophical possibilities of cultural knowledge. But here, when it comes to a very westernized idea of what counts as knowledge, it is the indigenous narratives are mostly reduced to the level of cultural knowledge or literary narratives and so on. Because so there what we need to understand is that when it comes to this untangling or contesting epistemic authority, it's about how the marginalized communities also need to be considered to be very significant, their narratives, their sources of experiences. So here there is a hierarchy that most of the time the universities and the academic world always try to fall back on, that is the kind of hierarchy between theory, literature, culture, experience. So in decolonial humanities actually try to challenge this hierarchy. That is, there are questions like, why can literature not produce theory, or why can't experience not generate concepts, or why should we sideline or ignore the indigenous intellectual traditions? So the knowledge systems of the marginalized communities, maybe they don't exist in the kind of theoretical form that we otherwise have from the West. But then why should we try to use a scale of evaluation that we have inherited from somewhere to examine or to assess the significance of the knowledge systems of our own marginalized communities? So, canon and epistemic authority is again a context where we, in the university discussion, in the discussions that happen in the academic spaces, there can be very strong presence of a decolonial perspective, which can actually help us to bring in more kinds of narratives which are from the non-Western societies, and giving them the kind of significance that they really that they deserve in the context of the epistemic hierarchies that we live in. And as we always know, English as a language has always carried a kind of epistemic power. So, language is another central site of coloniality. That is, when it comes to administration, law, education. So, English is simultaneously, in the Indian context, we have a very problematic relationship with English. It is a colonial inheritance, but it is also a language of social mobility, academic authority. So, it is that there is a larger question that we need to ask with respect to language as well. What happens to knowledge when one language becomes the principal gateway to academic legitimacy? So, there again, we need to bring into the epistemological question the concern regarding languages, because languages do not simply provide neutral containers for pre-existing concepts. Languages also organize categories or temporalities, relations. So different languages also frame, or different languages also formulate ideas in specific ways. So that is why when we have text being translated from one language to the other, the ways in which the transfer of meaning happens would be in a variety of it may not be a very easy linear process. There could be different kinds of complexities involved. So the question of language and epistemology, and this is again something very pertinent in the academic spaces, and pertinent for a decolonial perspective, because when we think of the kind of discourses, the kind of narratives that we immediately engage with as systems of knowledge, or as texts that are worthy enough to be discussed, most of the time we end up privileging narratives which are in English. Or so that is something that again sidelines that we maybe not directly but indirectly through our selections, probably because of the concern with availability of materials. What we do is, we at times we sideline, we ignore the kind of narratives that still continue to emerge from the regional languages. So this is again the question of how a decolonial approach towards knowledge would always try to ensure that we bring in a multilingual idea, or we try to see knowledge from a multilingual perspective. And then the question of how the shift can happen with respect to the being the object of knowledge to the producer of knowledge. So this is again a decolonial kind of engagement with the larger world of research, as well, as I have already stated, with respect to that binary between the researcher and the researched. Here, the conventional research model was always about the researcher getting a privileged status, and from the researchers going to the community, they collect data, they analyze the data, and they produce the knowledge about that particular community. But in the decolonial framework, there is a subtle difference in the way in which decolonial methodology attempts to move towards this idea of knowledge, that is research. When the researcher engages with the community, there are multiple epistemologies. There are multiple epistemologies that the researcher tries to engage with. There are different kinds of negotiations that the researcher gets into in order to arrive at some formulation regarding knowledge. So it is not a kind of a very linear process. It's a kind of a very circular or very complex way in which the researcher tries to analyze or tries to unearth different possible ways of or different possible sites of knowledge in that particular community. And this does not mean eliminating scholarly expertise. It means making the relations of epistemic authority visible and accountable. So here, rather than researching about, the objective becomes researching with the community, where this is very significant when it comes to indigenous studies or Dalit studies, feminist research. There is a kind of way in which the researcher has to situate oneself, where the researcher doesn't objectify the community or the group of people that the researcher is trying to study. It's more about having a conversation with them and trying to have a deliberation, trying to have a negotiation through which the researcher would try to formulate a kind of epistemic document. And there again, there is another major way in which we have to decolonize our approach towards the idea of knowledge itself, because there was a time when knowledge was always considered to be very the high sounding theoretical frameworks. But here, decolonization of the humanities also requires a reconsideration of what is literature or what literature holds. And this is again a very relevant concern when it comes to Dalit studies or the kind of indigenous narratives that we come across, because literature is often treated primarily as aesthetic object or representation. But when it comes to a decolonial approach, we are trying to understand literature as a kind of archive, something that challenges, that holds certain kinds of concepts, certain kinds of understanding. Counter archives, where the literary texts actually highlight the ways in which the dominant structures are critiqued and challenged. Then the kind of testimonials that exist in the literary, in the world of literary narratives, historical memory. So here, rather than trying to see what the literary text represent, it's more about what are the kinds of ideas that the literary text is sharing with us, or what forms of knowledge become possible through literary form that may not be available through conventional academic discourse. So this is something very pertinent when it comes to indigenous narratives. We have, even in Kerala, we have a lot of narratives now emerging in the regional language from the Adivasi communities. And these narratives are definitely from a very westernized kind of perspective. They may not be counted as knowledge, but these literary narratives are as strong as any kind of philosophical discussion when it comes to the kind of perceptions about life, perceptions about ecology, relationships, and so on, that these indigenous communities still continue to have. And again, now we come to Sylvia Winton and the question of human. So far we have been trying to engage with the question of knowledge. So together with the question of knowledge, there is a larger ontological question as well. Who counts as human? And this is from Sylvia Sylvia Winter, whose work is crucial because she questions the universalization of a particular Western conception of man. So, as in the case of knowledge, it's also about the way in which there is a construct of the universal human, who, and those who did not conform to this model would be positioned as primitive or irrational or uncivilized and so on. So here, the decolonial perspective actually takes us to the level of to our understanding of being or understanding of a human, where it is about who is recognized as fully human rather than who can know. It's also about trying to see how these epistemic formations are also grounded on a particular form of idea of a human being who can who is considered to be capable of creating different kinds of epistemic discourses. So here, in this particular context, it is about decolonizing the human, because rather than who has been excluded from knowledge, it's also about a question like who has historically been recognized as a knowing subject. That is the classification of humans, or if certain groups are constructed as irrational. And this is again something that that becomes applicable to the world of indigenous writings as well. That is here, so far if we have seen the question of coloniality of knowledge, here it is about the coloniality of being or existence. That is the question of ontology. So coloniality of knowledge is inseparable from the coloniality of being or existence. Sorry. And now we come to the question of humanism and the ways in which Said, Mignolo, these thinkers, these theoreticians who belong to post-colonial and the decolonial theoretical discussions, how they have tried to address the question of humanism. That is, Said actually retains a critical commitment to humanism while exposing the exclusions of Western representations. But Mignolo is more skeptical of universalizing humanism and emphasizes epistemic disobedience, term that we have already seen, or border thinking, pluriversality, and so on. So here the question is, should we rethink humanism or de-link from the universalizing concept of the human? So here it's again a very problematic kind of question when it comes to humanism, because the challenge is to imagine a form of universality that does not erase plurality. So plurality is something that definitely has to be taken into account. And plurality is, again, it's not a rejection of shared commitments, but it's an invitation to imagine alternatives beyond the hegemony of one world. So here again, for instance, when we think of justice or the idea of justice in a society, there are different ways. There are certain kinds of universal ideas regarding the question of justice, but together with those universal ideas, we will also have to engage with the cultural variations or the specificities of the idea of justice that different society holds. And last, we are almost moving towards the end of the presentation, where it is about digital coloniality. So far we have seen how the idea of knowledge can be reimagined through a decolonial framework, how the idea of the human can be again interrogated, can be again problematized through a decolonial framework. Now it is about the epistemic power that has now entered the digital infrastructures. So digital coloniality, where we are trying to question who controls the database, or who trains the algorithm to recognize the other, or which languages acquire computational visibility. So digital systems can reproduce epistemic inequalities through different kinds of data extraction or algorithmic classification and so on. So here again, the digital world continue to reflect different kinds of ideas that we bring under the larger discussion of coloniality. And the digital world demands a kind of decolonial examination, decolonial analysis to unearth these these kinds of invisible algorithms that define certain kinds of hierarchies. And then we come to the question of indigenous futures and digital epistemology. So here we have a situation where the indigenous, there are scholars who actually use the digital frameworks as well in order to engage, or in order to go deeper into the indigenous societies and their systems of knowledge. And two major theoreticians, McInnes and Medema, they are prominent African scholars specializing in digital media. And what they have done is they have they have collaborated to examine how marginalized languages and even epistemologies of the global south can be sustained and empowered through new media technologies. So when digital media can always carry the seeds of colonial hierarchies, digital media can also become a site of indigenous language revitalization, community archives, participatory epistemology, or alternative future making, and so on. So here decolonization is not simply about recovering what colonialism has destroyed, or recovering what we have lost through the colonial discourses. It's also about creating futures that coloniality does not completely determine, or that coloniality does not completely define and condition. So the decolonial project is simultaneously about being futuristic as well, using the latest kinds of possibilities of technologies in order to ensure that we give new kinds of possibilities to sections of society, knowledge systems that otherwise would have been totally erased from the globe. Here we have these digitizations, these digital technologies being used as community-led tools to capture and to consolidate the indigenous knowledge systems. And together with that, the question of environment is further and a very significant concern in decolonial studies. And here I'm just trying to introduce Deepesh Chakravarti's concept of the planetary humanities, which challenges us to think simultaneously about one planet and unequal human histories. So climate change is actually producing universal planetary crisis, but humans have not contributed equally to it. So here the statement is, what are the ways in which, or what are the kinds of the differential kinds of roles played by different sections of society when it comes to the kind of ecological issues, ecological problems that we encounter. And so definitely the planetary turn is a kind of contribution that has become a part of the scholarly discussions through the turn in decolonial studies as well. And finally, when we come to wrapping up of decolonial humanities, definitely the question of humanity or a homogeneous, there is no way in which we can consider even discuss Anthropocene or anthropocentric concerns from a homogeneous geological agent, or from the perspective of a homogeneous geological agent, because from a decolonial humanities perspective, it's about who industrialized or who categorized, who benefited. So there again, there is an unequal way in which the kind of environmental damage has happened across generations. So here again, it's about the way in which the decolonial humanities try to address the the kind of injustice committed by certain sections which are more, and how there are people who have contributed much less to these environmental issues, how they are struggling, or how they are becoming the first immediate victims of the climatic changes. So finally, when we come to the larger epistemological changes that I have tried to put together in the slides, the very first turn was from knowledge to power. That is the question of how there was this larger question of how whether knowledge is innocent or whether there is a power dynamics to knowledge. And there we have the post-colonial theoreticians like Said trying to reveal the relationship between knowledge and discourse and power. Then came the question of representation and authority, where again it was about who can represent whom. So there again we have Spivak's "Can the Subaltern Speak?" or Baba's concept of mimicry and the idea of hybridity and so on. Then from colonialism to coloniality. So what survives after formal colonialism? And that is where we have these decolonial thinkers like Quano, Mignolo, and Lugons, how they try to make us realize that colonial structures persist in modern power, knowledge, and subjectivity. And then we have knowledge to pluriversality. That is, can multiple epistemologies coexist? So there again, De Souza Santos and Mignolo, they challenge epistemic monoculture. So we have, for instance, when we think of the epistemological possibilities of the Kerala society, we have Adivasi communities with their oral traditions, forest knowledge, and so on. We have Dalit epistemologies, which act as counter narratives to Brahminical knowledge hierarchies. We have fishing communities, which carry maritime knowledge, coastal ecologies as situated knowing. So there are different ways in which multiple epistemologies can coexist, and that is from there, that is how we shift from knowledge to pluriversality. And then the question of human as the knowing subject, that is, who is recognized as capable of knowing. That is where we have Sylvia Winter and Lugons. They reveal the relationship between the category of the human and epistemic authority. And finally, we touched upon the digital architecture, where it is about knowledge to futurity. Who gets to imagine the future? So here, the African scholars Macanis and Medema, they extend decolonial thinking into the digital and indigenous discussions. And Deepesh Chakravarti has actually tried to look into the possibilities of futures, the planetary futures that he tried to engage with. It's again another example of using the decolonial perspectives to go deeper into the question of Anthropocene and the way in which the planet is getting, or the way in which different section, different generations, different geopolitical locations have contributed towards the kind of environmental disasters that we find right now. And then what would a decolonial humanities actually do? So you can just, these are some of the ways in which decolonial humanities can make result in transformations. One is epistemological transformation, whether it is where it is about knowledge formation, then curricular transformation, where it is about the kind of syllabus that we envision, canonical transformation, where it is about who becomes canonical and who remains marginal, linguistic transformation, where multiple languages can become languages of theory, methodological transformation, where collaborative and participatory research are also given equal and prominent presence in the academia, archival transformation, where oral, embodied, and community knowledge also counts as strong knowledge systems, institutional transformation, where it is about redistributing the epistemic authority, then digital transformation, where there is a questioning of algorithms, databases, and computational infrastructures, ontological transformation, where we try to get into the context of reconsidering what constitutes the human, or who constitutes, or who is being referred to when we try to use the word human, the kind of ontologies that actually define the idea of the human. And finally, futuristic transformation, where marginalized communities, how they can become producers of futures rather than merely objects of development. And that is where we have these digitization of indigenous narratives and so on. And finally, when we think of, just to wrap up, the future of decolonial humanities, it is increasingly at the intersection of post-colonial studies, decolonial theory, indigenous studies, ecological humanities, and so on. So there are a variety of ways in which the idea of knowledge, the idea of the human subject, and even the idea of how we understand the world around us is getting radically transformed through the kind of discussions that continue to happen within the purview of decolonial humanities. So, from post-colonialism to decolonial humanities is where we are trying to engage more critically with the kind of standardized, westernized, or universalized ideas that we use in order to understand and perceive and respond to the world around us. So with that, I think I have these are the kinds of discussions points that I wanted to discuss with you. So I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for to all the audience who are here to who were here to listen to the conversation. So I think I found that there were a few
Yes,
questions
ma'am.
being texted.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. let's go into the question answer session. I will moderate the session, ma'am. I will read the questions for you. So it was a wonderful presentation with a lot of inputs, and trust all the scholars who are doing their research now. They will, I think, they would have benefited out of this wonderful presentation. The first question I would select from one Mr. Kishwa. He's saying that the framework that you are using to define decolonization are formulated by Western hegemonic philosophies. Do we have any original Indian theorists who have discussed this? Or do we just utilize these Western perspectives and apply it in our case?
There, I would say that it's not about the Western theoreticians. Basically, decolonial theories actually started from the Latin American theoreticians, and the way in which Mignolo and even Sylvia Winter, they have tried to engage with the idea of decoloniality. But when we come to think of the Indian context, there the problem again is with the question itself. The problem is we try to use the idea of a thinker that we have inherited from the West. So when it comes to decoloniality in the Indian context, it's also about broadening and deepening our idea of what it means, or how we can identify any kind of discussion as a reflection of decolonial thinking. So there I would say even the indigenous writers, the Adivasi literature, the Adivasi narratives, these are all very concrete examples of decolonial approaches that we have in our own society. So maybe they are not part of the very institutionalized academic spaces, but we have such kinds of narratives, such kinds of discussions that are becoming very popular. So there, I would say that rather than trying to confine the discussion to one or two names, it's more about the emerging forms of narratives that are now becoming more and more popular within the Indian context, and especially in Kerala. As far as Kerala is concerned, I know for sure that we have a very strong culture of Adivasi narratives being emerging in the state, and also we have these getting published online as well as through different publishers. So there, I would say, if you think of the idea of environment and decoloniality, the writings of some of these Adivasi writers actually hold a larger idea of ecological philosophy, which we have not come across in the Western philosophers. So there again, it's a question of how to approach this idea of a decolonial thinker or a decolonial philosophy, where we have to have a revised understanding or a different understanding of what it means to be a decolonial thinker or philosopher, because that is exactly what decolonial humanities is also trying to argue. That is, we need to contest and challenge this very conventional idea of who happens to be a canonical thinker.
Thank you,
So
ma'am.
that is regarding my position.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
And another question is from one Mr. Muthukumar. He says, if British and Mughal are colonial powers and they have left colonial reminders, Aryanism, which is now the Brahminism, which has stayed here, is it not colonial also?
So the question was, what is in Brahmanism a kind of colonialism? The
Correct.
Aryan,
Yeah, correct. If
yeah.
British and Mughal is all colonial, then Aryanism, now in the form of Brahminism, is it not also colonial?
There, I would say that when it comes to this very idea of colonial, how do we engage with that concept? That is, the very roots of Brahminism that we started encountering in our civilization. It's something that happened much before, or that's something that we, even when we think of the Brahminic structures, the Varna system, and first or second or third century distinctions and the Varna structure and so on. But the British and the Mughal, they came much later. And when they came into, especially when during the Mughal period and later in the British period, They already came into a scene where we already had this kind of a caste system, a hierarchical caste system where the Brahmins were actually dominating the society. So coming to the larger question, whether it is rather than a colonized, the moment we had these Muslim dynasties coming in, we were into a kind of a very complex system where we had a Varna system, we had communities or sections of society which were outside the Varna system. And now, after all these years, what has really happened is many of these kinds of practices, which we now define as Brahminical, they have also become part of, or they have also influenced different kinds of engagements, different kinds of perspectives of different societies. So definitely, when it comes to this question of colonization, I would say it's more about power. So if the Brahminical communities or the kind of people who do not belong to the Brahminical community, the idea of coloniality comes in when there is a superimposition of these Brahminical ideas over the kind of otherwise existing kind of cultural practices or ideas that rest of the societies or rest of the sections of the society have. So definitely there is a power dynamics, if that is how we can think of a colonial understanding of the superimposition or the kind of hierarchies at times that are in play when we think of the cultural practices, or yeah, that's how I try to see
Yes.
it.
Thank you, ma'am. The same person, Muthukumar, has asked another related question. What about present day claims of universality of Aryanism, such as Bharata's Vishwaguru or the concept of Vasudeva Kudumbakam?
Bharada's Vishwaguru and Vasudeva Kudumbakam. The problem is, okay, there's conceptually, I would say, okay, Bharata is a kind of a larger teacher to the entire world, or this idea of the entire nation as a family. These are the way in which we try to engage with those ideas would decide whether we are entering into a very problematic terrain or not. Suppose we have this idea that when it comes to even Indian knowledge system as a phrase, it doesn't have much issue, provided we have a clear cut understanding of how we enter into this world of Indian knowledge system. So it's only when there is a kind of the kind of selection and elimination process, if that go into the idea of what we promote as the knowledge systems of India, or what we try to teach the world, what are the ideas that we try to teach the world. So there, if we are trying to be selective, that is the way, that is the moment where we enter into a problematic terrain. But otherwise, the whole the idea of family or the idea of Indian knowledge system, if we can critically engage and be reflexive about it, we need to have a self reflexivity. What is the idea of being a Vishwaguru, or what is the idea of the knowledge system that we are trying to place before the world? And that self reflexivity can really help us to ensure that it is more about bringing together a variety of ecologies of knowledge. That is where decolonial thinkers are also trying to present their position. Ecologies of knowledges, or the way in which there can be multiple epistemologies. If that is how we try to engage with the world, there is, I wouldn't say that there is an issue with that kind of an approach.
Thank you, ma'am. And another question is from Mr. Sagai Abi. He's a professor from Wachambo University from Ethiopia. He attends our webinars regularly. He's asking, how do Africans achieve decoloniality? Should they completely abolish colonial languages as the official mediums of education and governance in favor of revitalized indigenous languages? Do you think it will not create severe ethnic fragmentation, isolating the continent from global knowledge economies?
Yeah, there I perfectly agree with you, sir, that this question of being a part of the global system and still continuing to engage with the question of languages. Basically, as we have in the context of India as well, we have many regional languages. and we have English as a kind of language that connects people from the north to the south. There is a common, a kind of a link language that we have in the form of English. But here, what I would say is it's not about either or. It's not about either English or the other African languages. It's not about either English or the other Indian languages. It is more about how we bring together all these possible linguistic structures or all these possible linguistic discourses into our conversation and try to create the best forms of epistemological contributions out of that. So definitely sidelining English and focusing exclusively on the different languages of the African ethnic communities wouldn't wouldn't be a solution at this point, because we are into a global system where English is also, it's more than a colonial language, it has become a part of our everyday life. So in that kind of a context, especially with the digital economy, but there again, as I would like to reinforce the example that I had given regarding the use of digital technology by two African scholars in order to digitize the indigenous knowledge systems. So that is where English can also come to the help of preserving the ethnic communities, ethnic cultural practices. And again, we can also ensure that people have a larger exposure to the global discussions.
Thank you, ma'am. The same Professor Sagai Abi, he has another question. Uh, what is your opinion about coloniality and neo-colonialism?
Yeah, coloniality basically, it's about, as I have already stated, about the kind of colonial structures and colonial discourses that we continue to have in our society, in the ways in which we engage with the world. But neo-colonialism, I would say, it's about also the new forms of colonial or forms of power dynamics that have come to form, or the way in which societies, especially the societies in the global south, are now being colonized by different other kinds of forces, like the corporates, the multinational corporations, the kind of social media tycoons. So the ways in which we have new forms of structures, new forms of new power systems that are now entering or they are trying to control our society. And again, neocolonialism, if that is something that we can extend to the current geopolitical situation, even the way in which when we continue to have this conflict between Israel and Palestine, we still have this issue of oil and how oil is being controlled or fuel is being controlled. So there are different ways in which different kinds of control mechanisms are now reaching the global south, which actually affects the economy, which actually affects the everyday life of the people in the global south. These are all some of the kind of developments that we have started having in the recent times. So going back to your question, it is basically about the new kinds of forces, the new kinds of factors that are now gaining a kind of control over the global south, mainly in the form of the neoliberal economy, because neocolonialism is also reflected mostly in the kind of neoliberal economic conditions, neoliberal marketing that the global south is being a site of marketing, neoliberal marketing, where we have these new kinds of colonial presence in the global south.
And another request from one Samriddhi, she's asking that can you please explain a little bit more about Foucault's hierarchy?
Yeah, Foucault's hierarchy is basically the idea that I tried to use for the presentation is the question of the connections, the associations between knowledge and power. So here, Foucault is actually trying to argue that power, whatever counts as knowledge in every society, is a reflection of power. And when it comes to the very question of hierarchy, this is something that even the way in which the power structures function, there is a kind of invisibilization of power systems that also exist in our society. So power is, it is something, it's like a capillary effect where power is getting into each and every deep corners of the society. And there what happens is, on the one side, there is a use of different kinds of surveillance mechanisms. On the other side, there are also ways in which people try to the kind of hierarchies also exist not only in the form of the use in the form of force, but it's also in the form of narrativization, in the form of who counts as significant enough to be addressed, or even whose lives matter. Because even the question of life and death, whose lives matter and who which sections of society are left, or their death and casualties are not taken into account. So these kinds of hierarchies which we now encounter, especially when it comes to climate crisis or any pandemic, the kind of human lives that are ignored or neglected, and the human lives that are getting more privilege. So all these kinds of hierarchies are where Foucault is trying to argue that the very idea of human life itself becomes a site of power. That is basically his idea of biopolitics, where it is about the way in which the life of people itself is it is segregated, or it is categorized into different hierarchical domains, and that is probably one way in which you can understand the idea of hierarchies and power structures that Foucault has tried to engage with.
All the participants, please note that the form is working now. You can use the same form now. Dear participants, the feedback form has been shared again. Please fill the feedback form and submit. Yeah, please refresh your browsers and the feedback form is working. You can see Karthik Kumar AP, he has commented that the form is working now. You have to click the form again. Yeah, Nandita Anbu has mentioned that it's working. So it will be alive for next 15 minutes. You may submit it now. Also, the participant should note that submission of the form is mandatory to receive the certificates. Do not contact any of the organizers directly. We periodically submit the certificates to your email ID. Check your email ID periodically. Yeah, Malavika K. Nambiar has confirmed that it is working. I will drop the form again. So trust, I'll close the session now. Yeah, everyone is confirming that it is working now. Geeta Ramaswamy, Nasiba, Riddhi, everyone is saying that it is working. Sorry about the technical glitch we faced. The form was not accepting. Now, Francia Anthony is saying that it is working. So I'm just going to log off the call. So Ube Blossom is saying that it is submitted. So trust everyone has taken the form. I'm just going to close the session. I have I'm submitting the form again and again so that those who have missed the form, they can use it now. Okay, thank you everyone and good night. Let's meet in the next session. Next speaker is from University of California, Irvine. It's going to be a different Saturday and a different topic. Until then, signing off from you is Dr. Selvin from St. Joseph University, Dindivanam. Thank you. Good night.